Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Human Exposure Research in a Cyclical Industry, Part 2, Releases to Water from Unconventional Oil and Natural Gas Development. So the purpose of today's webinar is to increase understanding of specific unconventional oil and gas development, or UOGD, processes that might result in releases to surface water or groundwater and trends in those releases, to summarize research efforts for identifying potential UOGD impacts on water quality, and to describe operational information needed for decision makers to protect public health and to enhance utility of human exposure research from the federal perspective and from the state perspective. So just a few housekeeping items. All of you are muted with no audio for the duration of the webinar. If you're interested in submitting a question, you can do so via the Q&A function, which you can see in this picture here. You can also upvote questions from other participants that match your own question. We'll have a brief Q&A after each talk and then a 25-minute panel discussion at the end. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website. If you experience any logistical difficulties, you can message us in the chat box or email us at the email below. Please complete the post-webinar survey. It will pop up on your screen as you exit the webinar. We appreciate your feedback. It will also be sent to you in a thank you email tomorrow. So I'm Anna Rozovsky. I'm a staff scientist at HEI-Energy. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with HEI-Energy, I'm going to just give a brief introduction to our program. We're an independent nonprofit corporation chartered to provide policy relevant, high quality, and impartial science. We are funded jointly by government and industry. All of our research is selected, overseen, and reviewed independently of our sponsors. Oversight of the program is conducted by a committee, which is comprised of experts in toxicology, hydrology, epidemiology, air quality modeling, toxicology, petroleum engineering, and exposure assessment. And their purpose is to ensure the highest scientific quality and integrity of the program. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move on to our first speaker, Levi Kuhn. Levi Kuhn is currently the superintendent of the water management group for ConocoPhillips Gulf Coast and Rockies assets. He's a subject matter expert for water transfer, frac pit construction, water wells, and sourcing with ConocoPhillips. In the last 14 years, Levi has developed assets in the Permian, Barnett, Eagle Ford, and Central Louisiana Austin Chalk shales. He has spent the majority of that time in the Eagle Ford asset developing a broad infrastructure focused on supply of water for all ConocoPhillips without impact to the environment. Bob Hendricks is also joining Levi in this first presentation. He's currently in the upstream shales environmental and regulatory central team for Shell. He is a water subject matter expert for Shell, supporting water and wastewater related activities in the Americas, including assets in the US, Canada, and Argentina. He previously spent approximately 10 years in Shell's Appalachia asset, primarily focused on water protection and providing similar support to other US, Canada, and Canada assets. So the floor is yours, Levi.
Good morning, everyone. Like Anna said, my name is Levi Kuhn. I work for ConocoPhillips. Bob and I are going to take you through the overview of this water and produced water management presentation. A few things we're going to talk about this morning is going to be how we get water, where we put it after we get it, what we do with it after it comes back to us, and how we protect it after we use it. Water sourcing. So I've been in the oil and gas industry for over 14 years, and all 14 years of that has been within the water management group. And out of those 14 years, it seems like I spent 20 of those sourcing water. So water source comes from multiple different facets within lower 48, but a lot of them are basin specific. So if we take for the Eagle Ford, for instance, in my operations, we're at roughly 90% of the water that we use comes from groundwater sources. Some may be fresh, some may be brackish, but getting water out of a water well is the main thing that we do down here. The other 10% comes from surface water. When you look at the Bakken assets up in North Dakota, surface water is a predominant use of water in that world. They have a lot of landowner stock tanks, snow melts, you have your rivers, you have your lakes up there. Surface water is very prominent source up there. Now, when you look over towards West Texas in the Permian Shale in New Mexico, reused produced water is one of the biggest sources out there. Those oil and gas wells, they make a lot of water, and the best way that we can manage our sources is to reuse that produced water. Now, there's times that you don't have enough produced water to manage all of your operations. And so you blend it with a non-produced setup, whether that be groundwater, whether it be surface water, or whether it be any municipal wastewater. There's not a lot of municipalities in the Eagle Ford that they create a lot of gray water. There's likewise within the Bakken, but out in the Permian where you have Midland and Odessa Basin, you do have some gray water that you're able to use out there. It doesn't make up a large percentage of the water that's utilized in the oil and gas industry, but it does make a play in it. What do we do when we get all that water? So there's multiple different types of storage. Storage is one of the keys that we have. They take it, and managing that storage to make sure that it's safe for environment is one of the biggest ticket items that we have as an oil and gas company. You really have two main types of storage that play off of the pad site. You have your impoundments, and like the pictures on the right-hand side of this slide of those two impoundments, you can see those are fairly large impoundments, but impoundments through the oil and gas industry range anywhere between 30,000 barrels to over 2.5 million barrels of capacity, and they can be engineered to hold either produced or non-produced setups. You also have above ground storage tanks. Above ground storage tanks is a steel wall with a liner inside of it. They range anywhere between 10 and 60,000 barrels, and they're mainly used just to store off pad water so that you can have the capability of operations. You have minion tanks. Minion tanks is an on-pad setup. It's a steel walled structure that has a bladder set up inside of it that holds water on location so that you can manage operations at the rate that you need to. And then where minion tanks aren't provided, you have frac tanks. Frac tanks are a rectangular 500 barrel setup that are fully contained. And those between minion tanks and frac tanks, it's really operator specific and it's basin specific. Some operators elect to use more minion tanks than frac tanks, and a lot of it has to do with size of pad. So here's a few pictures of the three different storage capabilities we have. This is a picture from our Bakken asset. In the top right of this picture, you can see an above ground storage tank. It has the white inside of it is the liner, and you can see the steel walls that are built on pad, and the liner allows for water to stay within the confines of the tank. Over on the left-hand side, you have an example of a minion tank. You can see the steel walls around it, and then the gray dome top is the bladder setup that is in it, and that bladder setup fills and falls with the water sources inside of it. Now, when you don't have room for minion tanks, you can use frac tanks. And you can see on the lower right-hand side of these, you have 3 frac tanks that are the 500 barrel setups. And frac tanks in those small amounts of numbers are mainly used for lower rated injection systems. Now we'll go to a different picture, which is up in the Appalachian, and you can see we have the same style of AST up on the top of this picture, but you can see a double walled setup here. So this AST is set up with a fully contained wall and liner around the AST, the tank that is being utilized for operations. But over on the left-hand side, you can see multiple frac tanks that are set up in a line. And so where this plays at is when you don't have a big enough source coming into your operations, you have to store that water on site. And so having the proper storage and the proper volume storage, the proper mitigations in place for the type of water that you're looking to store is always key within the oil and gas industry. So now we're going to move on to produced water management. Every well in the oil and gas industry creates produced water. And with every produced water, you have to be able to transport it. It doesn't matter if you're going to reuse it or dispose it, it still has to be transported. 3 of the main methods of transportation is you're going to use either above ground temporary lay flat line or poly line. You're going to use below ground permanent pipeline structures, and where neither one of those are feasible, you're going to truck it, which is most trucks are 130 barrel tanks that come to pad, they load up, and then they either take it to your on-site storage or they take it to your disposal. Now in the oil and gas industry, we prefer to reuse our produced water. It's a lot more effective, not only fiscally, but environmentally responsible to reuse it. Reuse produced water creates a multitude of options for any oil and gas company. But the hard part about reuse and produced water depends on how you're going to store it. So there's multiple different assets within the lower 48, and each one of those assets come with different regulations of how you're going to be able to manage the storage. Take for Bakken, for instance, Bakken does not allow you to transport water, North Dakota, where the Bakken's at, does not allow you to transport water above ground via lay flat lines. And it doesn't allow you to store water in produced water impoundments. It'll only allow you to store water in tank farms on location. You go out to the Permian in West Texas and you can transport water above ground, and you can also build produced water impoundments. Now on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, the picture there, that's a picture of 2 produced water frac pits. Those frac pits are about 16 to 17 feet deep. They hold roughly 800,000 barrels apiece. And those are constructed with 4-to-1 slopes, built with a double liner set with a type of fabric material in between them. The engineering on that allows for any water that would come, any holes that may come from the primary liner is going to go in between the 2 liner setups down into an engineered sump, where then you're going to be able to have a pump down there and identify whether or not you have a leak between your 2 liners. Now, the reason that we have a secondary liner in these is so that you can stop all water from going into below ground. Now, depending on regulations, there's other ways that you can set these frac pits up. You don't have to have a leak detection on site. You're capable of having water wells that are on the outside of these pits, and then you have to monitor those water wells on a daily or on a frequent basis. Most of them is a monthly basis. You have to test your waters. Now, the impoundments in New Mexico, as you can which is a picture from the top left-hand side of this screen, have to have bird netting. Where you're going to have migratory species of birds, you have to have bird netting, or you have to have sirens or alarms that are going to deter the birds from landing on any produced water setup. And then last of all, like we spoke about, is that you can have centralized take farms on any pad site. It all depends on the type of space that you have, the amount of volume that you need to manage your situation, and it also depends on the ability for containment. Now, if we don't, in the oil and gas industry, if we don't reuse the water, then the majority of it will get sent to disposal, where it's going to be trucked, transferred via pipeline or above ground lines to a deep well injection, and then it's going to be sent down into the ground. And Bob's going to talk a little bit more on how we protect the groundwater and surface water when we do manage those.
Thank you, Levi. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up with Levi and provide him a little bit of a high-level overview of activities operators implement to limit the potential impact to surface water and groundwater. And I've grouped the activities into kind of 3 categories. The first 2 are preventive measures, and the third category, the monitoring and sampling, is more of an assurance measure and not a direct preventive measure. Next slide, Levi. First area there is the well design itself, and all wells are designed to protect the deepest potable groundwater. And if you look on the left-hand side, the zones that we protect are typically thousands of feet above the target production zone where the hydraulic fracturing actually happens. However, obviously, we have to drill through these zones that do need to be protected. And so to protect them, we install the surface and in some cases, intermediate cases, to seal off the potable groundwater to keep it protected. The depth of protection is dependent, again, on the basin. In some basins, such as Appalachia, you may be down several hundred feet to 1,000 feet. In Eagle Ford, the deepest aquifer you need to protect is 4,000 feet. So it will be totally dependent on what basin you're involved in and what the upper portion of the well design looks like. The casings cemented in place, and that, excuse me, wasn't expecting that. Sorry about that. For example, the casings are cemented and in place and eliminate the potential for gas migration and fluid migration from depth to the shallow ground surface. As an example, you may drill a borehole down to 1,000 feet that might be 14 inches in diameter, and you may install a 12-inch diameter casing. And the zone between that casing and the rock and the soil is then filled with cement, and that provides that seal against anything migrating on the backside of the well itself. Next slide, Levi. Spill leak management. There's numerous measures to prevent and manage potential spills and leaks. Again, these tend to be basins asset specific, based on regulatory requirements are in place to help us manage these situations. The surface subsurface risk profile is important. And also operators have their own internal guidance that sometimes goes above and beyond. The subsurface surface risk profile, what I mean by that is that in some cases, the migration exposure pathways will be different from a groundwater use standpoint or depth of groundwater, and that will often dictate the amount and the type of protection you need. One area is the pad design and construction. They're designed and constructed to minimize impacts. The location of them have setbacks often against private and public water supplies, surface water bodies, and wetlands, and things like that that might be significant receptors in the area. Some pads are constructed actually with a liner system underneath the entire pad itself to minimize any surface spills that might get migrate vertically to minimize that, so you have some sort of protection there. Stormwater controls are in place so that you divert clean stormwater from stormwater events, so that water cannot come onto the pads and commingle and result in impacted surface water conditions. Levi spoke a lot about secondary containment already. Just on the left are two photographs of a tank farm area showing the primary containment being obviously the tank itself, but then the piping and also the tanks themselves are in a secondary containment wall around them. Also in the lower right-hand corner, another tank that's got the containment around it. In some cases, and in one of Levi's slides, you saw it as well, that in a lower left-hand corner photograph, you can see that in some cases, activities are completely put on liner systems that are bermed, so that all the fracking equipment you see in this slide is actually all contained within a secondary containment, so that spill leaks occur, we can manage them much better. In some cases, the entire pad may also be bermed, and that provides secondary containment for all the activities on the pad. Operator response, again, that's going to be really dictated based on the regulatory agencies. Each state has its own reporting and response requirements in the regulations. In most cases, those again are somewhat dependent on the risk profile of a specific basin. Last slide. Last part is just the water monitoring and sampling programs that operators are involved in, and others as well. The degree and extent of water monitoring programs are state specific, and it can significantly vary within basins. As you may be aware of, the photograph at the bottom is in Appalachia, and the red and white square you see is an actual center of a pad. And you can see there's a significant number of private water supplies in pink and white surrounding that pad, and that radius is probably 2,500 feet out from that pad. And you can go to other basins like where we operate in the Permian, and you can't find a private water supply within miles of our operations. So again, very, very specific to the actual basin itself. And those programs can include groundwater surface water sampling from private water wells, also livestock wells, agricultural wells, depending on what's in the vicinity of a pad in operations. And as Levi mentioned, there are some water supply wells that we install that we also monitor as well. Some states provide specific regulatory requirements for monitoring. Some states also collect regional groundwater just to look at impact from more from a regional scale of the basin. And then, of course, you're aware that USGS, academia, and other organizations have also implemented water studies in a number of basins. So thank you, and that's all I had for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, to our next speakers. Both of them are from the US EPA. Amy Clark has been employed with the US EPA for over 15 years. She has worked her entire career with the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, including issuing permits, developing policy and rulemaking. Currently, she leads EPA Region 8's Oil and Gas NBTDS permitting program. Amy is an expert in produced water discharges and beneficial uses in Western US. She has a BS in biology from Virginia Tech and an MS in environmental sciences from the University of Colorado. And Angela McFadden is also going to be presenting here. She works in the Water Division of EPA's Region 3 office, which serves the 5 Mid-Atlantic states and the District of Columbia. She currently leads discharge permit program reviews, development of program accountability tools, and strategic planning and analysis for selected policy issues. Ms. McFadden served as Region 3's oil and gas advisor during the Marcellus shale boom, and prior to that as chief of Region 3's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Enforcement Branch. She holds a BS in chemical engineering and plans to complete her JD in 2022. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So today I'm going to talk about EPA's produced water oversight in the Western US, and then Angela will follow up with a discussion about produced water oversight in the Eastern US. So just to start off, I wanted to give a quick 101 on the federal regulations regarding produced water discharge and disposal. Federal regulations allow for the discharge of produced water to surface waters only in the Western United States. So operators west of the 98th meridian, which is approximately, if you draw a line down the middle of the continental US, that would be approximately the 98th meridian. And west of that line, oil and gas operators can discharge their produced water if it is of good enough quality for use in agriculture or wildlife propagation. And it must also be put to use during the period of discharge. Conversely, operators east of the 98th meridian, the federal regulations do not allow operators to discharge their produced water to surface water. Across the country, operators can send their produced water to centralized waste treatment facilities. However, current federal regulations do not specifically address produced water discharges, nor contain specific pollutant limits for CWTs, or centralized waste treatment facilities, that discharge produced water to surface water. And then POTWs, or publicly owned treatment works. By federal regulation, operators are not allowed to discharge unconventional oil and gas produced water. However, conventional oil and gas produced water is still allowed to be discharged to publicly owned treatment works. And then lastly, as Levi mentioned, there is the disposal of produced water through injection. And that is regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act and controlled by Class 2 permits, Class 2 underground injection control permits. As mentioned in the last slide, discharges of produced water to surface water requires a beneficial use or exposure, and that's done via wildlife propagation or agriculture. And west of the 98th meridian, we have about 450 permits for such beneficial use. Typically, the produced water discharge under those surface water permits undergoes minimal treatment to remove the oil before discharge. Also, there are a small amount of centralized waste treatment facilities, or CWTs, accepting produced water in the US, about 11 at this time, with only 1 or 2 in the West. Since CWTs are more prevalent on the Eastern US, I will allow my counterpart, Angela McFadden, to discuss those in more depth. And then lastly, POTWs generally are not designed to treat produced water, whether that produced water is from conventional or unconventional oil and gas. Next, I will discuss the specifics regarding the beneficial use of produced water in the West. In those 450 or so permits that allow for produced water to be discharged to surface water, the beneficial use is most often cattle watering, irrigating feed crops, and supporting game or wildlife propagation. And so the picture over on the right-hand side is actually of produced water, and you can see cattle are grazing, drinking the produced water directly. That's normal for us out here. Out west, we also have produced water used for irrigating rangeland directly near well pads, dust suppression and maintenance of unpaved roads, both inside and outside the oil fields. That's again a picture, the lower right-hand side there, and road de-icing as well. So moving forward, I will discuss some of the exposure pathways that can occur from the beneficial use of produced water, as well as the disposal of produced water. For disposal of produced water from production wells to injection wells, you can have the obvious spills and leaks from trucks, pipelines, and equipment failures. And those can ultimately lead to groundwater or drinking water contamination. For the discharge of produced water to surface water, you obviously have the ingestion of livestock, and this increases if the animal feed was also irrigated with produced water, which is typical for out west. Again, this photo shows produced water discharge and cattle in the background. There is also widespread hunting and fishing out west where these produced water discharges occur. The ingestion of livestock when brought to market and hunting and fishing would all potentially be an exposure via ingestion. We also have recreational contact. Some of our larger surface waters in the West that have these produced water discharges are routinely used in the summer months for full immersion swimming. And lastly, we have cultural uses such as sweat lodges. And for road spreading of produced water, there's the obvious inhalation of fumes, both wet and dry, dermal contact, specifically when it's wet, ingestion by children, runoff into fresh water, infiltration into groundwater, which presents a potential drinking water hazard, and the obvious spills and leaks. So next I will walk through some of the challenges related to permitting produced water for beneficial use. As you've heard from others, produced water is a complex mixture, and therefore permitting can be a moving target at times. Specifically, the challenges include older regulations from the 1970s when oil and gas industry practices and treatment technologies were very different than today. We also have an unknown and variable chemical composition of produced water. We typically deal with a lack of chemical disclosure requirements, which represents data gaps for regulators permitting these produced water discharges. We also have a lack of water quality standards for known produced water pollutants of concern, such as total dissolved solids, sulfate, and other inorganics. Most states and tribes do not have water quality standards for these simple pollutants. And again, you can see a picture here. This is a produced water discharge. It's steaming, obviously it's warm, it's hot, into a water body. We also have a lack of analytical methods for a majority of chemicals used in maintenance and stimulation. And then lastly, we have a lack of understanding about treatment technology efficacy. So in closing, I will discuss the permitting data gaps with their current science. We know water quality may improve downstream from these discharge points. The concentrations of organics generally decrease as the concentration of inorganics increase due to evaporation. Studies also indicate the uptake or bioaccumulation of contaminants such as radionuclides or biocides. Conventional analytics don't always tell us the full story. As I mentioned, these are complex mixtures, and we have unknowns such as a lack of chemical disclosure. Current analytical methods do not exist for characterizing the entire suite of chemicals that have been introduced and or transformed downhole. Current approved methods only really apply or monitor for acute or chronic toxicity on low-level aquatic life. These data gaps prevent us from understanding the potential implication for various animal receptors, including humans. Moving forward, we really need to understand the potential receptor-specific impacts so that we can identify the best management practices to eliminate or reduce the risks. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Angela McFadden, who will discuss produced water oversight in the eastern part of the US. Take it away, Angela.
Amy, thank you. And thank you, Anna, for the intro. I'll just mention that the Region 3 office covers Pennsylvania and West Virginia, which saw the Marcellus Shale boom start around 2008, 2009. I'm going to focus a little bit more on resources and challenges associated with researching issues around produced water. I will share that, some of the disposal methods that Amy mentioned are also disposal methods used in the eastern US. We have centralized wastewater treatment facilities. They can range quite a lot in the amount of treatment that they provide. Some are just providing very rudimentary treatment to the produced water so that it can go back out in the field and be used for hydraulic fracturing. Last time we checked, we actually had a pretty high recycle rate in our region. But we also might see a centralized wastewater treatment facility that does full distillation and recovers all the salts to sell them for road application. We have operators in the region now that are using underground injection wells for disposal, and we still have some counties that will use the produced water for road application, especially for road de-icing in the winter time. So what additional fate and transfer might we consider in the Eastern United States? With the centralized wastewater treatment plants, we're going to have sludges that build up in those plants that are going to contain contaminants from the produced water, and those sludges, when they're disposed of in a landfill, may contribute to contaminants in the landfill leachate, which may also be disposed back into a river or stream. And we certainly hope that the days of illicit disposal are behind us in our region, but it has happened. And some areas where oil and gas development occurs in our region are areas that have been heavily mined in the past for coal. They're full of voids and void networks. Some of them even have old, unmapped, abandoned oil and gas wells that can also act as conduits unintentionally. And we have many mine drainage discharges in the region. So, we don't want to see that material contributing to those discharges. As a researcher, you might be interested in certain key sources of information. There's quite a lot of information available for facilities that have discharge permits under the NPDES program. EPA has a couple of online databases where you can find information about permits that are issued, where you can find discharge monitoring data showing what's been measured in those discharges. We also have web services where you can pull, if you want to pull large data sets from those systems. And EPA has a couple of online systems, How's My Waterway and Water's GeoViewer, that can allow you to look at the proximity of these permanent discharges with other features. So, certain stream, or maybe water quality monitoring stations that are nearby, or even a downstream town that relies on surface water. Those are things that you might be able to see using these tools. Now, in large part, this material is regulated, the disposal, the management of the materials regulated by state RCRA Subtitle D programs. And those programs sometimes have their own resources. The state might have an online database where you can see where this produced water is generated, how it's disposed of, and the program might even have records that are maintained about that material, such as manifest records. And then again, there's also the underground injection control program. And for all of these programs, EPA and the states do maintain files that can be a resource. So just to show you what it looks like, this is what the GeoViewer looks like. You can see impaired streams, and you can see different discharge points. How's My Waterway will show you water quality monitoring stations, and again, impaired streams and discharge points. And this is an example of Pennsylvania's online system where you can actually look up produced water generation by well and export all of that information into an Excel spreadsheet, and it'll include the destination of that material. Now, what about ambient water quality? This could be very important if you want to know what's going on in the streams. Those of you who aren't familiar with the water quality portal might want to become familiar with it. Not only can you grab data from it online, but you can also use our packages to grab data from it in large volumes and analyze that data. And we're not just talking about pollutant parameter data, but also flow data. And in some places, depending on what area you're looking at and what type of pollutant you're looking at, there can actually be some interesting correlations between stream flow percentile and the loading for conserved pollutant. So, you know, that, and there are other reasons why you might want that data. You might just want to know under what conditions, you know, was the pollutant measured, and are they, you know, representative conditions. This is there's a very rich network that USGS maintains of flow gauges, and you know, I highly would recommend looking at these sources if you want to see what's going on in the stream. There's also information that's generated just from the assessment process. Our authorized states go out and they assess streams. They collect a lot of data about the stream. Some of that goes into STRAT, some of it goes into other places. But it does make sense to take some time just to understand that framework a little bit, so that you can see what types of information is generated from that. EPA has an attains database where you can find information about integrated reports, where the state will explain what they've determined about streams based on the collection of data. You can find out if the stream is subject to a total maximum daily load. And you can see what the plans are for restoring that stream. And you can also see what causes the state's identified when they've found impairment. So it's also probably worth understanding water quality standards just a little bit. These are standards that are set for streams, and they are comprised of two components: the designated use of the stream and a criterion that's established to protect that designated use. Most criteria are numeric and concentration based, but not necessarily. And in some states, they have adopted criteria for total dissolved solids constituents that we see in produced water, such as chloride. So, if you're looking at a parameter like that, it's might be worthwhile to understand if there's a standard adopted, if the state's assessing, to look at that water quality with respect to the standard. This is just showing what the water quality portal looks like, where you can pull data, ambient water quality data. I also want to just mention data about public water systems. If you're interested in seeing if there are systems that could potentially be impacted by pollutants in rivers and streams, there's quite a lot of information in databases. We have EPA's CIDWIS database, and then we also have oftentimes state public water system databases that might provide more information. EPA's database has information about whether or not a public water system is complying with the maximum contaminant levels for drinking water. But state systems might have more information in addition. They might have compliant results as well as non-compliant results. And sometimes they will have more detailed reporting about the parameters. So if, for example, you're interested in trihalomethanes, the state database might have the 4 different species reported separately, not just the total like you would find in EPA's database. Now, it might also be important to understand a little bit about the interplay between the Safe Drinking Water Act programs and Clean Water Act programs. There can be relationships between the maximum contaminant level and water quality standards or criteria that are adopted for a stream. They might be adopted to protect a secondary MCL, which is really established more to protect the quality of the water. So it might be important to look at that if you are interested in certain parameters. Is there a primary MCL for that parameter? Is there a secondary MCL? And if there's a water quality criteria that's been adopted to protect the drinking water use, what does that represent? Does that represent protection of a primary MCL or secondary? It's also important to look at how the state applies the standard. Some states will apply a water quality criteria that's adopted to protect drinking water throughout the entire water body that's been designated for that use. Some will apply it only at the intake for the public water system. Just want to mention a couple of things about challenges that you can encounter if you're researching oil and gas wastewater as destination, potential impacts. Sometimes you have site features that might be challenging, such as seeps, and you're trying to understand the transport of material, but you're working with a seep, might be difficult to sample in a representative manner and fully understand that transport. I mentioned earlier that coal country can be full of mine voids or even abandoned wells. And if you're looking at a private well, drinking water well, it's really important to look at how that well was installed. Was it properly constructed? Sometimes there can be issues with how it was sited that might be challenging for really understanding any impacts to that well. If you're looking at a site and you need reference conditions, sometimes that can be an issue. We've had areas where researchers were looking at radioactivity and looking at road application of the brines, but found that the area was so historically applied with this material that it wasn't easy to find any reference conditions to compare to. And then of course you can also have confounding contributions from other sources. And if you are studying a public drinking water system, maybe you're working with that system to look at the quality of the water, and you're looking at the user's water quality, it's important to understand what variation there might be in the treatment for that system and what their flushing schedule is. So I'm just going to wrap this up by promoting the idea of using quality assurance project plans. It's really helpful for getting your whole team on the same page of music as far as the project objectives and understanding what all the steps are in the project. If you're planning to do some statistical analysis of the data, it's important to figure all that out ahead of time and really document that in the QOP. And one thing that's central to the QOP is really looking at what level of reliability you're going to establish a standard of reliability for your data, and trying to set up your project in advance to satisfy that standard if possible. Overall, setting up the project for success. So with that, I'll open it up for questions if there's time.
We actually do have time, and just a couple questions for both Amy and Angela. Thank you for some really some great and illuminating presentation. So Amy, you showed on your third slide that there are approximately 450 discharge permits. And we're just wondering how many of those, or what proportion of those, are for conventional versus unconventional operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer kind of varies with how you define conventional or unconventional, because sometimes it's referred to as it's not hydraulically stimulated is conventional, and if it is, it's unconventional. So it does depend a lot on how you define it. But I think for us, what we try not to focus so much on is the difference, because we do feel like the wastewater or produced water from those wells are comparable to each other. They have a lot of the same pollutants of concern and challenges with permitting. So we actually don't technically differentiate between the two, excuse me. But I think for the purposes of this call, I would say I can definitely tell you about 200 of those are coal bed methane. The rest of them are a mix of conventional and unconventional. That's kind of the best breakdown I can give, because again, we don't really differentiate from the permitting context because they are so similar in their pollutants of concerns and challenges regarding permitting those to surface waters.
Thank you so much. And I just want to remind the audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to submit those versus in the Q&A. And Angela, just one quick question about the USGS database versus my water quality database. Are those the same data source? Do those overlap in any way?
They don't. While EPA's online systems for mapping all those things might show locations, USGS maintains completely separate data, and where they overlap is in the water quality portal. So it's a water quality portal where you can pull both ambient parameter data, like pollution parameter data, and flow data as well.
Great. And so we have, I'll just ask one more question from the Q&A box here. In which oil and gas basins are there produced water disposal facilities that rely on evaporation for disposal? And this might be, you know, something that we could talk about in the panel too, for Levi or Bob.
Yeah, I think that might be helpful to have the kind of a panel discussion on that. That might be a better place for that.
Okay, great. Okay, and just one more from Marcellus Shale Coalition. For clarity, in Pennsylvania, unconventional operators have not discharged to surface water since April 2011 and has never been used or approved for roadway application for de-icing. Approximately 93% of wastewater from unconventional operations was recycled in Pennsylvania last year. That was just a clarification from the Marcellus Coalition.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, Isabel Cazzarelli. Dr. Cazzarelli brings 35 years of experience to interdisciplinary studies of the environmental effects of unconventional oil and gas development and waste management activities, crude oil spills and impacts of landfill leachate and urban wastewater and water quality. Her research at field sites across the US focuses on the long-term evolution of biogeochemical processes and the natural attenuation of contaminants. She uses a combined field and laboratory experimental approach to investigate contaminant partitioning and exposure pathways in environments stressed by anthropogenic inputs of biodegradable carbon. She received an MS and PhD degrees from the University of Virginia in environmental sciences. And the floor is yours, Isabel.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Hopefully everybody's seeing my full screen. And I'm happy to be here this afternoon talking about some of the work we're doing at USGS, looking at unconventional oil and gas development effects on water quality. And I'll get right started. This work is part of what is called our USGS Energy Life Cycle Project. So here we're looking overall to understand the potential impacts of a range of activities associated with the life cycle of energy development. And we're looking at the impacts on water resources and environmental health, including the potential contaminant associated threats and effects to humans, wildlife, and ecosystems. So this is comes under our environmental health programs, which is part of our ecosystems mission area, where we're conducting broad studies to understand and mitigate what are actual versus perceived health hazards posed both by energy and mineral resources development. So we currently have research efforts all across the United States. The yellow stars show some of our study locations in different basins across the US. And a few that I wanted to highlight in the Appalachian Basin, we're doing some studies on source characterization, also watershed scale oil and gas development studies, and some UIC injection well studies. In the Permian Basin, we're looking at some illegal dumping of oil and gas wastewaters on BLM land. And in the Williston Basin, oil and gas wastewater pipeline spill and some legacy waste disposal issues. So we're taking a pretty interdisciplinary approach to our projects. So you can see all of the disciplines we have among the members of our team. And we're working together to look at both, pore scale processes, typically experiments done in the laboratory, to site scale exposure pathway investigations up to regional scale impacts in watersheds. And our goal really is to kind of build towards some national understanding of these types of challenges. We collaborate outside of USGS, of course, with university colleagues and other state and federal agency partners. So you already heard a great review about kind of what happens to produced water that's developed during oil and gas development. So thank you for that introduction. This schematic kind of summarizes what you heard in the last several talks. All of these pathways of movement of fluids and disposal of fluids are potential places where you could have environmental releases. So there is some information in the literature published by USGS colleague Kelly Maloney here in Science of the Total Environment, looking at some of these releases. And they are occurring across the US, and they affect large geographic areas. As mentioned before, the reporting does vary, the reporting requirements by state. So it's a little hard to compare, one state from another. But in this assessment of 4 states, which was Colorado, New Mexico, North Dakota, and Pennsylvania, they found 2 to 16% of wells reported a spill each year, with the largest of those exceeding 100 cubic meters. And most of the spills are related to storage and moving of fluids. So I'm going to talk about one of our investigations, and this is of a North Dakota wastewater pipeline into Blacktail Creek. And our objective here was to identify and characterize the fate and transport of the constituents that were released during the spill and evaluate if there were any health impacts to wildlife or humans. So this was a really large spill. It was 11 million liters of wastewater that was leaked from a pipeline, and it flowed directly into Blacktail Creek and discovered in January 2015. And at the time, this was the largest wastewater spill in North Dakota. The wastewater contained hydrocarbons and had very high total dissolved solids of 300,000 milligrams per liter. And I just wanted to mention here, I have many collaborators on this study who are listed on the slide there. So our investigation, we completed 4 rounds of sampling, and this included sediment, water, and biota. So pretty soon after the spill, we went out there in February 2015, and then in June 2015, and we followed up with yearly sampling in June 2016 and June 2017. As mentioned in one of the previous talks, we don't always have background or pre-spill conditions. So one of our strategies when we're doing research at a site like this is we collect samples upstream from the spill as an indication of background conditions. And then we also sampled in an adjacent river for another sort of background or control. So our initial study results were published. This is open access in Science of the Total Environment. So anybody can get this paper without having to pay a subscription fee. And we found numerous semi-volatile hydrocarbons in the creek, tri and tetramethyl benzenes and methyl and dimethyl naphthalenes. And these, interestingly, were detected in unfiltered samples, but not filtered samples, which gave us an indication of the importance of sediment potentially as a transport mechanism. We also looked at volatile hydrocarbons. Those are the light hydrocarbons C1 to C6, and they showed a distinct thermogenic hydrocarbon signature. And this signature was still present in June 2015 at 7.2 kilometers downstream. We looked both upstream. I guess I'll orient you to this slide. BCR and LMR are 2 reference sites. And these are downstream going in the direction of the water flow. So the pipeline is plotted here. For comparison, we were able to get a sample of the pipeline fluid, which sometimes can be a challenge when doing studies like this, but we were lucky in this case to be provided with a sample of the pipeline fluid to compare to what we saw in the waters. So you can see here we had pretty high concentrations of sodium chloride, bromide, strontium, lithium, and boron. And one of the tools we found very useful is strontium isotopic signature. It had a distinct signature, making it a good tracer and useful in mixing models. And some of the contaminants are associated with sediment. So we looked in June 2015 at sediment-bound ammonium, strontium, barium, and radium. And you can see those also were elevated downstream. Strontium in the downstream sediments also retained that radiogenic signature that was reflective of the pipeline. We found radium-226 was 29 times the background activity in these stream sediments. And follow-up studies that we did in the floodplain in 2016 showed that radium was also present in the surface soils of the floodplain, apparently transported there when the creek flooded. So we did some in situ studies of the early life stage fathead minnows in June 2015. And these are exposure experiments using this model fish, which is often used in these sorts of bioassays. And we noticed, well, most notably, that survival of the fathead minnows after 96 hours, we found 88 to 95% survival at the background sites. But at one site downstream from the spill, only 2.5% survival of the caged fathead minnows. We also found on-site mortality of native catfish observed. The live resident fish were observed at all sites, except for this one site downstream from the spill, where no live fish were observed. So we hypothesized that it could be focused groundwater discharge coming into the creek as a pathway of wastewater into the creek at specific locations, and that could be contributing to this fish mortality. So our approach really focused in the next stage of our study on whether we could identify those seeps using a combination of tools. Geochemical tools and geophysical tools were used, and we just published those results in Science of the Total Environment as well, and the reference can be found there on this slide. So the tools for geophysics that we used included shallow sediment bulk conductivity that was via a handheld electromagnetic imaging. We also used high spatial resolution electrical resistivity profiles and an infrared camera and temperature sensors to identify locations of groundwater discharge. And here I've got on this plot a comparison between a background seep that we identified using those tools and one seep down gradient from the spill site. And you can see the down gradient seep has a chemistry consistent with signature of oil and gas wastewater with elevated chloride, sodium, bromide, strontium, boron, and lithium. And again, that down gradient seep, we looked at the strontium, and the strontium isotopic composition was indicative of the pipeline composition. And you can see here on this diagram, which we refer to as a mixing line diagram, that this seep here at 7.2 kilometers downstream from the spill is on the mixing line between our reference groundwater and the pipeline fluid composition. And it represents between 0.1 and 1% pipeline fluid mass. So another tool that we used to test hypotheses about oil and gas wastewater inputs was geochemical modeling. And here we used a model called FreakC, which has an inverse modeling capability where we can propose a set of reactions to account for a range of background compositions And then we calculate how those reactions, that we quantify, how they can control those background compositions. And so the kinds of things that go into the model are like salt recycling reactions or mineral weathering reactions, mixing with rainwater or gas phase composition. So the importance of this is you really need to understand what controls the background water composition before you can understand whether any variations that you're seeing in chemistry can be due to mixing with wastewater. So by doing this exercise, we were able to determine that at these two sites downstream from the spill, 0.3 and 0.1% of the composition required mixing with wastewater. And these wastewater constituents are often stored in bank sediments following transport down the channel and can be released episodically into the stream. So we've used some of these same tools at other sites. So I just wanted to briefly mention a few of them. Here are where we're looking at water quality from historical oil and gas wastewater activities in the Prairie Potholes region. And we found ratios of some of the constituents, particularly some of the major ions, were important in determining effects on amphibians. And again, at this site, sediment was an important route of exposure of contaminants. We found freshwater organisms such as mussels and mayflies had a greater sensitivity to these waters than certain fish species that are often used for bioassays. We also looked at a deep well injection facility in West Virginia to identify and characterize the impact of any wastewater disposal activities on stream biogeochemistry. And again, using some of the geochemical tools. And at this site, we also looked at endocrine disrupting activity at sites downstream from the injection well. So at this site here on the little map, this is the flow of this small creek in this direction. And we found at these sites downstream, we had elevated chloride, sodium, strontium, and barium. We also had impacts to the microbial community where the composition compared to background shifted due to these oil and gas wastewater inputs. We didn't look at this site at the health of aquatic organisms, but we did find potential for adverse health effects due to endocrine disrupting activity in the surface water and altered nutrient cycling and this microbial community structure alterations. And the last study I'll just say a couple words about is a recent study we're doing on intentional wastewater dumps that are occurring in the Permian Basin on BLM land. The photo here was provided by our colleague Terry Gregson of the BLM. And starting in November 2017, they've had a rash of illegal oil and gas wastewater dumps. 39 sites have so far been identified. And the wastewaters are a mix of brine and hydrocarbons, and they're dumped directly onto the landscape. So one of our objectives here is to see if we could use our tools that we've developed to identify the sources and potential impacts of this intentionally dumped wastewater. And so we've been looking at a number of sites across the landscape here and characterizing composition both in control sediments as well as in dumped sediments to see if we can understand some of the changes in the soils that are occurring and potentials for exposures. There are animals that graze in this area. And so we're looking at radium and extractable hydrocarbons and trying to assess biological effects from these oil and gas wastewater dumps. This is particularly important in an arid area such as this because sometimes even the dumps, which are water, will attract wildlife to them and they'll graze there where they might not otherwise. So in summary, just some of our take home from our studies at these sites is that We've been able to identify numerous geochemical indicators of oil and gas wastewater that we can use both to track and identify spills and also assess potential effects. We also have seen that the partitioning of chemicals onto sediment, such as radium or metals, can limit the movement of those components, but also can provide another source of contaminants to organisms that might live in that sediment, or humans who might become exposed to that sediment. Some of the spills do pose potential health risks to, we've seen fish mortality, amphibian population effects, and endocrine disrupting activity of the waters. One of our other big lessons that we've learned is that reactions and dynamic hydrologic conditions really can change what the potential exposure routes are over time. In particular, things like variable groundwater discharges into creeks can really affect the surface water chemistry. And really, to understand this, these effects at the national scale, you really need to understand oil and gas releases, that are occurring in a range of different landscape types. So I included my email at the bottom there. I'm happy to take any follow-up questions also by email or share any of our papers with anybody who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. So we're going to save the other questions for the panel session and move on to our next speaker, Julie Murphy. Julie Murphy is the director of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, to which she was appointed on July 1st, 2020, from her position as Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Advisor. Murphy's oil and gas regulatory expertise draws from 7 years of service with the Colorado Department of Natural Resources. Prior to her current appointment, she served as COGCC's director and the Hearings and Regulatory Affairs Manager. Also, she was an Assistant Attorney General representing the Commission and Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. Murphy earned a BS in Wildlife Biology from Kansas State University, a Master of Earth and Environmental Resource Management, and JD from the University of South Carolina, and a Master's of Studies in Environmental Law from the Vermont Law School. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks to my panelists that preceded me. As you'll quickly learn, I'm certainly more of a lawyer than a scientist, and my talk will be focused less on the science of this and more on the policy setting side of it. And I don't know if you can start my video. I know I can't, although nobody actually needs to see me. That's totally good with me. But I'll go ahead and jump right in. All right. There we go. Thank you. So setting state policy, what do we need from scientific research? To kind of get us oriented, what I would like to do is take a few minutes talking about the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and what it does, how that integrates into shared regulatory authority in Colorado over oil and gas operations, talk a little bit about the regulatory evolutions over 25 years. And that to me is really to set the stage for how science shapes policy and at times how policy shapes science. So jumping into who is COGCC and what do we do? Our mission statement was highly adjusted in 2019 to shift from fostering the development of oil and gas resources to regulating oil and gas development in Colorado in a reasonable manner to protect public health, to protect and minimize adverse impacts to public health, safety, and welfare of the environment and wildlife resources, and also shall protect against any adverse environmental impacts on any air, water, soil, or biological resource resulting from oil and gas operations. That's directly from our statute as it was amended in 2019. Currently we have a five-person full-time commissioners that are designed to adjudicate, oversee, and make decisions for our organization. Each commissioner has a different focus of expertise. We also have 2 ex officio non-voting members who are cabinet level appointees or their delegates. And so while I as director operate the organization budget, HR, I make some policy decisions, we're in the position of also shifting most of our decision-making authority to our commissioners. Again, what does the staff look like? We have 140 members on our staff. We have a leadership team, and internal organization organized by disciplines. And then jumping into this concept of shared authority, which I think is particularly important. I pulled this slide from a presentation we gave to a joint meeting of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation and the Air Quality Control Commission, which is the body that oversees air emissions in Colorado. And you can see a lot of overlap, and flagged in this also is EPA looking again at some of its air and water requirements. What's not on this slide is our shared authority with the Water Quality Control Division, which is another division within the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. And so we partner with EPA on downhole wells and also the Water Quality Control Division on protecting surface and groundwater. And that is pursuant to legislation passed in 1989. It's 89-189. COGCC is an implementing agency of groundwater protections, but we rely exclusively on the Water Quality Control Division as it relates to setting standards for groundwater and also for regulating discharges to surface water and setting water quality control standards. This is another example of kind of the shared authority. Again, the legislation that was passed in 2019 in Colorado really shifted Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission's relationship with local governments, in that local governments are now empowered to regulate surface impacts of oil and gas development. So when we think about location of oil and gas facilities and specific, surface impacts, air, water, et cetera, the local government has a much stronger role than it used to. At the same time, OGCC's mission change, or COGCC's mission changed, as I noted, from fostering to regulate. And also as part of that kind of landmark legislation, Air Quality Control Commission received more broader authority and direction around protecting public health, safety, welfare from oil and gas emissions. The legislation didn't speak specifically to the Water Quality Control Division. I think that's in part because I believe our Water Quality Control Commission and division staff are doing a great job of evaluating and protecting against impacts. So that's all kind of the precursor to start talking about regulatory evolution. And I've picked the last 25 years because it's a significant amount of time. And I think it really showcases what the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission and the state of Colorado has done to improve regulatory requirements for oil and gas to, again, eliminate and minimize emissions or impacts to all sorts of media. I would draw your attention, I think, first to 2008. That was another really landmark year for our organization. And in 2008, oil and gas development in Colorado was really focused in the Piceance Basin, which is the west half of our state. And it's mostly a gas play. And it has an incredible water shortage. And so what that has led to is needing increased protections for wildlife, and led to a focus on consolidating facilities. And also, because of the nature of water limitations in the Northwest, we see a lot of our produced water sharing agreements and reuse, produced water reuse in the Piceance Basin. From 2008 until about 2014, the shift in development moved from the Piceance Basin with low gas prices to the DJ Basin, which is in northeastern Colorado. And it is also the area where we have the fastest growing population of human beings. And so that shift in 2012, 2014 was a result of the advent of hydraulic fracturing and the horizontal wellbore, right? And with that change in technology, really being able to drill out a horizontal wellbore, all of a sudden unconventional oil development became an opportunity. And again, we have this interesting intersection of robust oil and gas growth in communities and in areas where population is increasing dramatically. So starting in 2013, 2014, there's a shift from looking at protecting wildlife and consolidating facilities into what do we need to be thinking about in terms of proximity of oil and gas to human beings, and what does that mean? In 2014, we overhauled our plugging requirements, which is why I think we've largely eliminated emissions from plugged wells. And then Air Quality Control Commission adopted regulations requiring methane emissions reductions. At that time, Colorado was leading the nation in that arena, and really stepped into the space of innovation, policy driving innovation. In 2015, again, we started focusing in on enforcement and increased protections for floodplains. I think these are the floodplain regulations particular were kind of groundbreaking regulations in that 2 years prior, COGCC or Colorado had suffered from enormous flooding. And what we learned out of that process around how we can better protect water resources from floodplains was a really important regulatory look back at a real world example of a scenario. In 2016, again, we were focused on this relationship with local communities, local governments. 2018, we overhauled our flow line regulations. And again, flow lines are what moves fluids in pipes that is within COGCC's regulatory authority. I know that's an awkward statement, but pipeline regulation is one of the most fascinating and complicated areas of law that I've come across. And then in 2019, again, kind of hearkening back to where we are as of 19, is a huge shift in how we regulate oil and gas. And as a result, we have rewritten almost our entire regulatory requirements, which has a couple of benefits of being more readable, being organized topically, and better understandable, and also elevating the protections. And so with that, I wanted to kind of, I guess I gave a pretty good recap there of what Senate Bill 19-181 did to improve the regulatory environment in Colorado. And what have we done? Again, we've made some pretty significant changes. I do want to draw your attention to one more place where we've made significant improvements, and that's in our wellbore integrity requirements. It was a particularly interesting rulemaking, and wellbore integrity is really the focus of making sure that when we drill a well, everything that we're pulling up out of the subsurface stays in the wellbore and doesn't migrate into other geologic formations, whether they're water bearing, gas bearing, both. And that wellbore integrity requirement was pretty fascinating. Focusing now on the rules that we adopted in the fall of 2020, they were adopted November 23rd. They became effective January 15th, that are really focused on water, given the focus of today's conversation. So I think that the way we have thought about minimizing impacts is in 3 different phases of thinking around development. One is avoiding impacts through planning, right? The second one is how do you minimize the risk if there is an impact? And then the third one is how do you mitigate the risk, again, if there is an impact. So a lot of our focus is really on planning and pre-planning and making sure we're considering the hydrology in particular around a proposed oil and gas location. We have specific prohibitions on development within proximity to specific types of surface water sources and some groundwater protections. Again, we're trying to incentivize avoiding development within a floodplain surface water supply area, public water system, and then up gradient of a wetland or riparian corridor. Again, if we can plan to avoid these particular areas, we reduce the risk of impacting them. And then focusing more on, I guess the one other piece I should hit, given my discussion about the peons, is that we've really tried to incentivize water reuse and recycling to eliminate the use of fresh water through better planning and tracking. And that right now is pretty focused on a data gathering space. So how much are we reusing? How much are we recycling? And those can be really difficult numbers to track when you think about the same molecule of water flowing through 3 to 5 or 35 different wellbores. How many times did that get calculated as reuse? How much does that actually offset? So that's been a really fascinating and I think evolving conversation for Colorado, at least. In terms of minimizing the risk of impacts, again, we have specific best management requirements if you're in proximity to sensitive waters, floodplains in particular, robust wellbore construction, wellbore integrity, monitoring and testing and plugging requirements. And again, this is to make sure that the wellbore itself doesn't leak, doesn't create impacts. Enhanced secondary containment requirements. We changed these to a uniform number across the state of 150%. Prior to that, it was kind of a site specific and difficult to calculate and harder to enforce. And then also one of the ways to reduce impacts is to make sure what's on site is a chemical that's less problematic, right? And so we did adopt a prohibition on certain chemicals and fracking fluids to eliminate the risk of those fluids being on site or those chemicals being on site. The third kind of echelon of protection is mitigating impacts. And this is once we've had something happen, how do we make it less bad in my mind? And one of those is an enhanced spill response requirements to avoid offsite impacts. robust wellbore tank equipment and flow line integrity management protocols. Again, how is your system working? Is it actually maintaining integrity? And if it's not maintaining integrity, let's find out quickly to eliminate those releases or spills. And then making sure that we're tracking and reporting what chemicals are on site, so the first responders are responding, they know what's there and they know how to adequately manage the risk. So I think that that's a really broad suite of rules. I'm happy to talk in more depth about them. And then kind of closing out the discussion today around policy and what drives policy, what drives science. And with the methane regs, again, I think that Colorado was a little bit out in front on what emissions control technologies were available. But by setting a bar saying we're going to do this, I think it helped drove scientific innovation. And now to me, the innovation in methane control technologies across the states and then that I see deployed in Colorado just continues to astound me in terms of what we've been able to achieve and what we're continuing to expect of our operators in Colorado. Touching back on the wellbore integrity regulations, this was one of the most incredible processes I've been a part of as a policymaker, in that we had an environmental organization and 3 industry representatives come together and say, we can do this, we can rewrite Colorado's wellbore integrity regs and make them better and be more protective of groundwater, surface water, and again, making sure that we keep what's in the pipe. And then the last component, and this is my reference to CIDR, which is the new database repository that Colorado is developing for cumulative impacts data, is going to collect a lot of data about anticipated impacts from oil and gas development. And I think that is a kind of data set that scientists can use to help drive innovation and think about what we should be doing differently, what we should be doing next. And so to me, it's a really iterative conversation between science and policy, with different parts leading on different components. And I think another area where science can be particularly helpful is in a look back of how regulations are working, how they didn't work as well as they could have, and identifying kind of the sources where we can continue to tweak and improve. And so with that, Anna, I know I'm at least a minute over, but happy to take questions.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. And I'm going to hand over the electronic mic to Donna to run the panel session. And again, if you do have any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. Thanks.
Great. Hello, everybody. I'm Donna Voorhees with HEI-Energy, and I want to welcome back all of the speakers. If you aren't too shy, please come back on camera. Great, great. And I'm going to go through the questions in our Q&A box. Let's see. A question that I think we didn't have time to answer during the presentation. The question was, in which oil and gas basins are there produced water disposal facilities that rely on evaporation for disposal? I believe this question came in during EPA's presentation, but anybody is welcome to answer, but I'll turn the mic over to Amy and Angela first. Probably Amy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't be able to say all of the basins, but we definitely do have them out in our region, out west in Utah is a big one, a big state that has evaporation. Wyoming does as well. Obviously, colder climates present a little bit more challenge than that. So I'm probably not the expert on that, and I might refer to Robert or Levi for that, but we definitely do have them out west. It is a viable disposal method, particularly where the climate will allow for such.
Okay. I see nobody else jumping in on the response there. I'm looking. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to the next question. The next question is, thank you for your presentation. This is for Isabel. Do you have any preliminary results on the Permian Basin study, particularly fate and transport of compounds through those arid soils, either through observations or modeling?
You're on mute, Isabel.
I thought I unmuted, but that button is tricky. So we've given some presentations at professional society meetings. So, you know, we have some abstracts where we've looked at, you know, what's in the sediment, but we don't have any publications yet. You know, this is a pretty new study. And we do have some results on like trace metal uptake in some of the plants. So in terms of fate and transport. We have some results there, but again, we don't yet have those data published or available. But if you'd like some of the references to some of the presentations that have been given, just go ahead and contact me. And I think I also wrote in the chat, my colleague Denise Acob, who is leading that study, her email contact as well.
Great, thank you, Isabel. A general question, I think, for a lot of you. I believe, Amy, you had mentioned that it's when asked about the 450 permits and distinguishing between conventional and unconventional, said, it's actually doesn't sound like it's part of your charge to do that. And then Isabel, you were talking about and providing some good tools for perhaps assessing whether releases are due to oil and gas. In general, if somebody's doing research, what are the challenges if they want to be able to distinguish between conventional releases that may have occurred from conventional operations versus unconventional operations? Is there a way to distinguish? Is there any hope there?
Would you like me to start? I'll go ahead and
yes. Okay.
okay, I'll go ahead and start. So I think one of the main goals would be to see if you can get samples of your potential sources, so that you could identify, either geochemical tracers that might be unique. In one of our studies in West Virginia, for example, we were able to identify in some of the wastewater affected stream samples additives that are only used, in hydraulic fracturing. So, and we could distinguish then effects from the activities going on at the UIC well site from a lot of the historic coal mining activities that have occurred in the region. So I would say, like, kind of knowing something about or getting samples of your potential sources would be one key approach.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm just looking around the panel. Is anything to add, anybody? No? Okay.
Yeah, I'll just add and kind of support Isabel there. It's not always easy because there are some similarities between the conventional and unconventional, but one thing I've seen over the years is the isotopic data is really critical, because you can look at the strontium, as Isabel mentioned, and that's, if I look at the Appalachia region and, in the shower conventional, the ratio there is different than what you probably would get in the Marcellus. Same with the, carbon and methane, just the methane isotopic, the carbon and hydrogen there. So those are kind of key indicators. You could even possibly use dissolved oxygen, deuterium and oxygen for looking at the water itself, because there'll probably be a difference in the age. And that's what's nice about the isotopic data. It really just doesn't change. So you've got that as to lean on for looking at the sources.
Okay, great, thank you. And I guess a related question, I think those responses answer it, but Angela, you referred to a number of databases that people could consult, but I think based on what we're hearing, those databases would simply provide information about water quality, would not provide information about the source of any issues that arise in those samples.
Well, if we're talking about permitted discharge, then one can pull from EPA's ISIS database discharge monitoring reports that will show, concentrations or loads of pollutants that are regulated under that discharge permit. And that can be important, whether you're looking at that discharge as a cause or you're just trying to differentiate other discharges that might be a cause.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay,
sorry, I was just going to add, if we have time, I was going to add, unfortunately, from the federal regulations that allow for the discharge for the beneficial use of produced water, it doesn't distinguish between conventional or unconventional. So sometimes the permits won't even help you because they don't even ask whether or not these are coming from unconventional or conventional sources. So a lot of times it's really going quite upstream to the operators to figure out what type of operation they have, and if it is unconventional or conventional or CBM. Even, like I said, about half of our discharges are from coal bed methane. But yeah, unfortunately, the federal regulations don't require us to distinguish between the two for that beneficial use. It can be from conventional or unconventional, or coal bed methane as well, potentially.
Okay, we have two questions for Julie. Julie, what data is going to be collected through the cumulative impacts data evaluation repository?
Sorry, couldn't find mute. It's on kind of almost everything in my estimation: air emissions, wildlife impacts, kind of related to surface disturbance, water related use and discharge. I can like pull up the rule series and walk through it if that would be helpful. But to me, it's robust. And I mean, I think there's some consideration of disproportionately impacted communities. So sorry for a really broad summary, but to me, it feels kind of like everything.
Okay, everything is pretty all-inclusive. Maybe, Julie, if there's, you can direct people to more information about that where they can read the detail, that would be great. Yep. Maybe you can send that along to us. We can distribute it to panelists, or yep. Would that be possible? Okay.
Or you could add it to the chat box too, a link at the end.
If you'll give me just a sec, I'll kind of hone in on where in our rule series it is, and I can put a link to the rules and then kind of a specific page, if that would be
all right.
helpful.
All right, and actually the next question is for you, Julie, if you don't mind. And then, yeah, so the question is that you made reference to some chemicals that aren't allowed in hydraulic fracturing fluids in Colorado. And could you give an example or discuss the parameters that are used to select those products?
The list came to us as kind of a collective, these aren't great chemicals to use. So we didn't, from stakeholder conversations again, we didn't have a really strong lead in driving the development of the list, but it came to us through stakeholder discussions. It was agreed upon that these are good things to ban. I actually managed to pull up our 400 series rules and can screen share the list if folks would like to see them, if that would be helpful, or I can chat a link to it and direct you to the right page.
I think putting something in the chat would be great. And if we have time at the end and you can screen share that, that would be helpful too. But I think first just get through the questions.
Sure.
Oh, okay. Levi, a question for you. You talked obviously about water management at the well pad, and there's interest in sort of trends in how water gets managed, transported to and from well pads, and how trends, well, by definition over time, whether there are more truck traffic, less truck traffic, efforts to reduce truck traffic. And part of the rationale for this question is that at least HEI-Energy's program is also dealing with air quality issues. So traffic to and from a well pad is also of interest. But just in general, interested about trends in water management, how they've changed over time.
So as an operator, especially with the technology from the drilling side as well as the completion side, with longer laterals and more volumes of water per well being utilized, the reduction of truck traffic is key, not only for fiscal responsibility, but as well as for environmental and local stakeholder responsibility. The evolution of lines to transport water has came a long way, where back in 2010, 2011, 2012, a lot of companies were utilizing more irrigation style line. Couldn't transfer a lot of water through it, and took multiple lines to get your volumes and rates that you needed. Where now you have a pretty leak proof system, if installed properly, of lines with the lay flat line, fire hose style line that can go up to 16 inches in diameter. And so you can transport large volumes of water and for a lot less cost than what you can with trucks. And then also, I mean, you look at just the truck traffic alone. If you look at the Permian, the truck traffic alone, it's if you were to put more trucks on the road to transport water to site, it would just be unimaginable, because you're also having to utilize some of those trucks to take water away from site. So the trend's really going to get away from trucks, not only, like I said, for the fiscal side, but also for just the prudent operator side for your stakeholders, local communities.
Great, thank you. Another question pertains to literature released some time ago in the Appalachian region, where there seemed to be a decreasing trend in reported spills and leaks and whatnot. So the question is, how do things look now? In other words, trends in potential for releases to the environment. Is the potential less now than it was originally, as more and more development occurs and more experience is gained in the unconventional realm?
So I'm going to say the potential is still there, and if anything, probably the potential has increasing due to just the amount of operations in a consolidated area. But so is the technology and capabilities of your vendors and the operators of ensuring that you have the proper processes in place to deter those spills. And if you do have a spill, you're getting the communication is a lot better through just those technologies, through automation technologies, and you're able to shut down operations faster and get on a spill a lot quicker than you used to be able to just 2 or 3 years ago. So it's not necessarily the capabilities of, or the ability has decreased for spills. It's our ability has increased to manage operations to not spill.
I would say that agree with what Levi's saying, but in Appalachian, specifically in Pennsylvania, I mean, the regulations are have changed significantly from when this all happened in 2010, 2011. You look back in those time frames, and I was involved in the assets and in the basin, and nobody was doing anything on purpose, but the management was not nearly as good. I mean, in Pennsylvania, you've literally got to report a spill if it's over 5 gallons, outside of secondary containment. So I think, the coalition, the operators worked really strong with the regulators to come up with some very protective guidelines now that the reporting is there, and to be honest with you, you're in people's backyards, so you get it off site. You don't want to really be messing around with, dealing with landowners and everything else. And so I think as an operator, you find yourself being very responsible to try to, do things right and respond. As Levi said, we've got back trucks on site lots of times during drilling and hydraulic fracturing activities, just to make sure we have things in place to be able to manage and respond effectively.
So a related question, and this is partly because a number of people in our audience are people who are working to not just look at environmental changes, but whether human beings might be exposed to something. So of spills that have occurred or could occur, I'm hearing from you, Levi, and you, Bob, mechanisms are in place to control these spills. So if somebody's looking at, say, state records about spills, are they going to know whether that spill had any potential for human exposure? In other words, yes, you had to report that it was spilled, but it was also contained right away. I mean, or it was spilled and maybe there was a broader release where a person might be exposed. Research should be able to tell from the records, typically in state available from states or EPA for that matter.
I would say that the answer is yes for the most part, but it also depends on the area, the regulations, the state, and then also the company. Because normally if you have a spill that is going to be a reportable spill, you're also going to report the type of remediation that was performed within that, right? And so whether it be in any water bodies, whether it be in any tributaries, or whether it be just on the ground, you have levels of remediation that you have to report for the not only to the state, but upwards within our own companies, that we have to report within that to make sure that the remediation was done properly and you don't have any future impacts.
Great, thank
Trying to get
you.
on, yeah, trying to get off mute there. Yeah, I kind of agree with Levi. I mean, the biggest thing you'd probably have to do though is from the summary that you would maybe get from the DEP, it would be very difficult to know exactly what happened. And you know, the whole remediation, the response piece, you'd know that there was a spill. And so you'd probably have to do maybe a file review at the office to be able to get something more specific for a specific spill on a pad, rather than just relying on, you know, a database out there is my experience.
Okay, great, thank you. Julie, another question for you. You made reference to, I think you used the word accountability, but trying to assess whether the regulations being put in place are having their intended effect. Is Colorado pursuing such analyses, or any other state, as far as you know? Is anybody checking to see if their regulations are actually functioning as intended?
That's a fantastic question. And to date, I don't know of any formal kind of mechanism that we at Colorado have developed to validate. I think the places that we indirectly see it is when researchers find their own prerogatives around whether it's, you know, a leaking wellbore and some of the study that's been done on that front, or in different areas around air emissions where folks have wanted to investigate. And then it confirms or identifies places where we've grown. And so short answer, not that I know of nationwide. I think the idea of the CIDR database is a way for us to be looking at impacts, at least, or anticipated impacts, and what those actually are ground truthed out to be. One of the interesting intersections of the database, the data that we're gathering for air emissions, and then what is actually reported to the Air Quality Control Commission or the Air Pollution Control Division, is a prospective look at what air emissions are expected to be, and then a retrospective look at what they actually were from particular facilities. So we want to make sure that we're collecting similar data sets so that we can actually do real-time comparison of those two pieces. So there is a bit of a almost QA/QC in those regs, but I'm not sure that we've really devoted a lot of time about thinking about how we can do that more comprehensively or more formally. But it's certainly an interesting thing. And I guess like the one thing that is really fascinating for me about watching science and policy change in Colorado is that our policy has been changing so quickly that it's hard for, in my mind, like science to keep up really effectively, because it takes a long time to design a study, to develop it, and then to put it through peer review or put it through appropriate levels of review. And so we end up getting scientific review of facilities that would no longer be allowed under our new rules. And so kind of resigning those two facts can be really difficult for people trying to understand what our rules allow and don't allow, and what that means going forward. So I'm sorry, Donna, I went way off script on that question, but it's one of the most interesting places for me.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I mean, that's helpful for the scientists in the audience to hear, because when they're designing their studies, they need to be cognizant of the regulatory environment. So that's great. That's great. Okay, we have gone through all of our questions. I would just invite the panelists, if you have questions for one another or comments that you would like to make at this point. Otherwise, we might actually finish one whole minute early. Okay. Okay. All right. I think we're good. And thank you all so much. It was really terrific.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, we want to thank everybody for great speakers and everybody for submitting questions. HEI will make the webinars available on our website in the coming weeks, and stay tuned for announcement of future webinars. And please complete the survey. We would love to get your feedback on what you thought of this webinar. Thanks all.